Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today, we're going over a tutorial on how to run Synology DSM within Synology DSM by virtualizing it. So this is actually a really useful thing that people often overlook because it's really nice to be able to just spin up a virtual DSM instance, and now it's kind of like you've bought an entire second NAS because all of its security settings, everything will be isolated from the main NAS. So say you want to set up a web server and you love DSM, and honestly, Synology DSM makes it incredibly easy to run websites and things like reverse proxies and everything like that really easily. But you've got some sensitive files on the main NAS, so you don't want it exposed directly to the internet. What you can do is you can actually just set up a virtual machine on the NAS, a virtual DSM instance, do all your port forwarding, all of that stuff to that virtual instance. And now your virtual DSM can't have any access to the actual real NAS. And so it's a great way of isolating for security or testing or anything else you need in that sense. So if you've got a friend who wants to be able to back up their stuff to your NAS, but maybe neither one of y'all want to trust each other too much, you can go ahead and do the exact same thing there. The friend gets their own amount of storage, and it's like they have a NAS at your house that has no other access to the main NAS. And if they encrypt the volume, neither will you. And so there's a ton of really useful stuff you can do here, and it's really often overlooked. And this will work with any NAS that can run Virtual Machine Manager. I'll leave a link down in the description below to which ones of those are there. And you get one free license, and after that you can buy additional licenses, so if you want to run multiple virtual DSM instances. And setting this up is really easy. I'm going to go ahead and do this on my DS923 Plus. By the way, subscribe. We're trying to hit 100,000 subscribers, so if you like these tutorials, always appreciate that. But we're just going to go ahead and get right into it, and I'm just going to log into DSM. And the very first thing we're going to go ahead and do is just go to the Package Center and download Virtual Machine Manager. So just go in and install Virtual Machine Manager. This does require a BTRFS volume. Ideally, you have a BTRFS volume anyway. And now we're just going to go ahead and open it on up. It is going to take us through this first time setup wizard to actually make sure everything's configured properly. Sometimes this open vSwitch setting may be not able because you've set up link aggregation where it does not require the switch specific configuration. So that's the only time that may be disabled. If you're doing that, switch to SMB multi-channel. Or if you're just looking for redundancy, set up active, passive, or if your switch supports it, actually do true LACP. So we're going to go ahead and hit next, and it's just going to go ahead and automatically configure that. The next thing we're going to go ahead and do is select our volume. And I've only got one volume here, but if you had multiple, you could actually set up an entire storage pool or volume just for this. And while this is going ahead and installing, I want to talk about what a virtual machine is. A virtual machine is almost identical to a physical machine, but it just shares some resources from what's called the host. So a virtual machine is what's called the guest, and essentially it is controlled by the host, but it is its own isolated machine. It's going to get its own local IP address. It's going to run and handle its own scheduler that just gets told to the main CPU scheduler. It is going to handle everything almost identically to how a real machine does. And I use virtualization all the time. I never recommend people install a server bare metal where you install like Windows or whatever service you need on the physical hardware because it's a nightmare. It is something that you're always going to need some reason to have a virtual machine because it's something that you're always going to need another machine, another instance. And that way you can spin up tons of virtual machines with very low overhead. So these are a really useful tool to have, and I love setting them up. I've actually got a video showing all my virtual machines. I use XCP&G and Zen Orchestra to manage everything. I'll leave a link down in the description below to that. But this can do a lot, and we're going to go ahead and just set up that virtual DSM instance. All right, so now we are set up and ready to go. The first thing we want to do is configure our network. And we can actually add multiple network interfaces here depending on how we want to do it. So if you wanted to attach like a static public IP address, you could actually do that here really easily. Or if you wanted to, you can actually just use the same network. I would recommend coming in and just setting whatever network interfaces you want, and you can do all your VLANs and everything like that. I'm only going to select the single one that's actually hooked up to this, but there's a ton of stuff you can do here. Virtual Machine Manager is actually really in-depth and has a lot of really powerful features, and you can actually cluster it out and do HA. It's honestly a really underrated feature that I wish Synology would build some dedicated hardware for. Now that we've set up our network, we're going to go ahead and download our image. And right here, we're just going to go into our DSM image and hit add. And this is where, if you wanted to, you could download a virtual image from a specific instance and upload it from your computer right here, or just click download virtual DSM image. And this is just going to download the most up-to-date version of virtual DSM. And so that way you don't have to deal with it. Just going to hit download. Give it a name if you want to. And now you choose where you want these ISO files to live. And I would just check the regular one and say default so you don't have to deal with it anymore. And so now it's going to go ahead and just start that download process. Should download pretty quick. While I'm sitting here waiting quite a while, I should mention having an SSD cache or a all SSD volume will speed this up many fold. This is one of those things where if you have SSDs, it's a huge difference compared to hard drives. This is just hard drives in here, so just the act of creating this has taken a little while, a minute or so, but it has gone ahead and finally healthy. And now we can actually go ahead and deploy our virtual machine. So once we've got our image, all we have to do is come into our virtual machine tab right here and just hit create. And it's going to give us a bunch of options. As I said earlier, there's a lot of different things you can deploy, but we're going to go ahead and choose Synology Virtual DSM. Select our storage. If you've got multiple, that's there. And now all you do is you just say what performance you can give. All of these can be changed later on. So I'm going to give it 3 cores. By the way, when you're setting up CPU cores, they're shared. So I can give this thing 4 CPU cores, even though this DS923 that I'm running it on only has 4 CPU cores. That's because when you're dealing with CPU cores with a virtualization, they're shared. So you can kind of think of this as a max. So if I did 2 cores, at most it'd be able to take up half the processing power of this DSM. And you can also go in and reserve some threads if you need to, and things like that there. You can also change the priority. This is how much scheduling time it gets. So if you set it to very high, it will go ahead and take over most processes. But if you want it to be low and you want other stuff to go ahead of it, you can set it to low there. Now, the next step is to give it RAM. RAM is the opposite. So where CPU is shared between the host and the guest, RAM, or memory in this case, is not. So if I give it 2 gigs of RAM, it's taking 2 gigs of RAM anytime the machine is on. So that's just one thing to note. Now we're going to go ahead and give it a virtual disk size. And this is what's going to be called thin provision. What that means is if I give it 5 terabytes and it's only using 100 gigs today, it is not going to actually take up 5 terabytes on disk. So I'm going to give it 100 gigs, and this can be increased later, but it cannot be decreased later on. You can also create multiple disks if you wanted to. So if you had an SSD and HDD volume, or whatever you want to do. You can also enable space reclamation, which is very useful if you're using this as a NAS. And you can even set up specific IOPS ranges. That's like how much performance it is allowed to take. But we're going to keep it very simple and just have a 100 gig disk. Now for a network, if you'd created multiple, you would add that in here. And then auto start, I normally would say last state. So when DSM boots up, if the VM was on before DSM shut down, it'll start up. If it was off, it won't. Now just permission for whoever can connect to it. And really it's just who can turn it off and on. Because once again, the virtual machine will handle its own authentication. And now we're just going to go ahead and say power on after creation. So it's going to create pretty quick. And the next thing is, this is special just for Synology DSM, is the license. So this is where that one free DSM license comes in. So this is your one free license, and we've got to assign it. So if you want to have multiple, you'd have to buy those licenses and input them in here. And this only applies to running ones. So what you can do is if you have like 4 or 5 virtual DSMs, but you're really just using them for testing, so only one of them ever needs to be on at a time, you can shuffle these licenses around as much as you like, as long as only one of them is active and on at a time. So once we've assigned the license, it's going to go ahead and start booting on up. And here's where we can actually see what the network's doing, what the disk is doing, and all those lovely things. We can see because we gave it 2 gigs of RAM, now our DS923 Plus that only had 4 gigs of RAM to begin with is starting to feel a little bit of a crunch with RAM. 2 gigs is enough to run DSM, but you will notice a performance. Generally 4 gigs is enough to not notice a single performance issue whatsoever with DSM, and then 8 is excess, especially if you're running a lot of things. So 2 gigs is a little tight, but it'll be fine. We're not doing too much on this thing. Windows needs like at least 8 gigs of RAM to run, and even then it's not going to run great. Ideally Windows gets 16 gigs of RAM, and that's where it can be very painful to have to run Windows virtual machines. One thing I should also mention, I know this is not about Windows virtual machines, but I'm talking about it while it's powering on. Unfortunately, Synology has not yet introduced VTPMs, so you cannot yet run Windows 11 on these things. We'll see if they do or don't. It is something that's very complicated, and Windows 11 has very annoying requirements, even for virtualization. So now what we can see is we're going to go into our resource monitor. We're going to see the real impact of running these things is when you're running virtual machines, volume utilization, especially if you're running on hard drives, tends to be the limiting factor. So right now, once again, DSM is very efficient, so it's not too big of a deal. But while we're installing it, you can see that these hard drives are clicking away. So that will have a major impact. This install and this boot up would happen significantly faster on an SSD volume or a volume with an SSD cache. With virtual DSM, you basically just connect to it once it's booted up because, well, you don't really have a BIOS for Synology DSM. For all other versions, you actually connect to a console that kind of just shows you the screen as if it had a screen. So we just have to wait for DSM, or the virtual DSM, to fully boot and get an IP address. So that way we can connect to it our network, just as you do with a regular Synology NAS. Part of the network tab is you will actually see the MAC address that has been created here. And by the way, we just saw that IP come on in. That means it's booted up and it has reached out to my router and requested an IP address because it's acting as if it's a physical piece of hardware. It's got its own MAC address here that is essentially acting like a virtual network card. So now that we've got an IP address, we just connect to it. And it's just like setting up a regular Synology NAS, just you don't have your hard drives. So I'm just going to go ahead and let this thing start up, and then we're going to create our accounts. All right, so now all we have to do is hit start, and we're setting this thing up just like a real Synology NAS. As you see, it gets its own credentials, it gets its own Quick Connect, I think. It is its own unique device for all intents and purposes, other than the hard drives for the most case. And so just like that, we're going through our regular installs, our update processes, everything like that. We can go ahead and set up a Quick Connect. We can go ahead and set up pretty much everything that we want, just as if we were a regular NAS. And now, boom, we are in and we are all set up, and we can do everything just the same. The only real place you're going to see a difference is, well, one, it's going to tell you VDSM rather than anything else, but is when we come to our storage manager, we don't have any hard drives, as you can tell. We don't have any options. It's very, very, very controlled by the actual parent operating system, though it is its full own operating system here. So we can set those settings here, and we are not able to set a scrubbing schedule. Now let's talk about some of the really cool features we can do and why virtualization is awesome. Other than just being isolated out, is let's go ahead and create a shared folder. and put some data in there. All right, now I'm gonna shut this thing down and take a snapshot of it and kind of show you all the cool stuff that happens when we do that. So just like regular snapshots, you can take a snapshot of a virtual machine. And that is actually at this level. And you can set up what's called a protection plan to do this automatically. And that is where it will run on a certain basis. If you have the license, you can actually even replicate them to another machine. A lot of cool stuff there. But what we're going to go ahead and do is wait for this thing to shut down. That way we make sure it's consistent. You generally can still take a snapshot while the machine's running. However, that may not be application aware, and so it might not be perfectly restorable. So for anything critical, like you're redoing a massive setup and you really need to make sure you got the snapshot, I would always recommend shutting the VDSM down and then taking a snapshot. So now, boom, I just created that snapshot. Happens very quickly, and we're gonna go ahead and boot it back on up. We could even clone it or anything like that. There's tons of options you can do here, but one of the best ones is for tinkering and trying out new configs. You can just take these snapshots and then it's so easy to go back to them if you break anything. Easiest thing to do is wait for this thing to boot on up, and then I'm gonna break everything, shut it down, restore from snapshot, and boom, everything's exactly as it was when I took that snapshot. So all of our files are gonna be back, all of our configurations gonna be back, all of our settings, everything will just be returned to that previous state. It's like you reached into the past, grabbed the hard drives, and stuck them in the current machine. So I'm just gonna log in here, and I'm gonna break everything. So let's go ahead and delete this shared folder. This is something that regular snapshots would not protect you from, but virtual DSM will. I'm also going to change a few settings here. And what the heck, and install an application. So this is great. I can test out everything, mess around, have fun, really see whatever I want to do. And the reason it's so useful for testing is it's quick and easy to undo anything I break here. So let's say while I was messing around this DNS server, I broke everything. All right, well, let's just go ahead and shut it down. And then we're going to go ahead and basically undo that. So within this tab over here, there is also a snapshot list option that we can actually use to restore to this snapshot or even clone it as a new VM. So if you wanted to have a lot of different people testing different things and everybody kind of has the same starting place, you just clone all your VMs and then just delete them later on. Or in this case, let's go ahead and go into our snapshots, and we're just going to roll back to this time with restore to the snapshot. Favorite thing, take a snapshot before restoring. That way, if there's like, there's that one thing I wanted to grab, you can pull it back from the past. This will wipe it back. There will still be that snapshot, but they're giving you an extra warning here. And it's incredibly fast how quick and easily it has restored. And all we got to do is power it back on. So while this thing's booting up, you can see that not only is it incredibly useful for testing, it's also great for security, because you may have a company that you have very sensitive data, but you also have a portion of your data that you want to be able to share out with people publicly. Very common, you want to have essentially a public Dropbox that you can share links, and Synology Drive is really good at that. But maybe the rest of the NAS has a lot of really sensitive information in it that you do not want any chance of getting out. Since it's a virtual machine, it is isolated out from the host. And so what you can do is you can create that virtual machine that's publicly exposed and even change it to a different VLAN, like on a DMZ or something. And that is publicly accessible. You share folders off that. But if the craziest thing happens and that gets infected, there is almost zero chance that a guest could ever infect a host. They're very isolated out. There have been some lab studies that have shown it might be possible, but those are really, this could happen things. Not really any exploits that have ever happened in the wild. DSM is booted on back on up, And we're gonna log in and we're gonna see that everything's exactly as it was beforehand. We can see that if we go in here, oh, our folder's back. All of our settings are back. Our packages are exactly as they were. Everything has just been rolled back exactly as it was. That's the beauty of virtual machine snapshots, is they can pull everything back because all configurations were part of that snapshot. And that's how you can use this. There's a million other ways you can use virtual DSMs. They're super useful and just really fun to play with. If you have any other questions or you want to hire me, there's a link for that down in the description below, and put your questions down in the comments below. And have a good one. Bye.